sermon. They're sacrificing that time, and that's why the invitation is also for men, because I can tell you right now, guys, you're going to love playing with William. That boy can throw the ball, and he was nonstop. Last time I worked in there, that was all we did. And I was just like, oh, he's going to be something. So, yeah, it's a way to serve the body. And we're gonna see that that's in fact what Christ calls us to from our text. But before we look at the text, last week we looked at Mark 8 to prepare us for the text that we were going to look at. And now I want to look at Mark 9 real quick just to prepare us, because this is the second in Mark's gospel, the second passion narrative that Jesus gives. And our text this morning, the reason why I want to look at this is because our text this morning is going to be the third one. In Mark 9, beginning in verse 30, they went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask him. And they came to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? And catch this. Right after Jesus just told them he is going to suffer and die and be delivered over to be killed, they keep silent about what they were discussing right after Jesus told them that. Why? Because they were arguing with one another about who was the greatest. This is going to be a hard sermon for us to hear, and I'm going to warn you about it up front, okay? Because our text is going to expose something in us that will be hard personally for you to hear and to see. But do you know what the leading cause of death is in the United States for both men and women? Heart disease. In 2019, pre-COVID, so we don't have 2020 because the numbers are all messed up, but in 2019, over 655,000 people died of heart disease. Heart disease starts when there's any blockage in the artery that restricts the blood flow to the heart. See, when this happens, the heart muscle begins to shut down, and when it begins to shut down, it can lead to a heart attack or it can lead to stroke. Then when more than one artery is blocked, the heart can completely shut down and die. The most common procedure for heart disease is called bypass surgery. It's where grafts are inserted into the arteries so that it can redirect the flow of blood to the heart. I mean, any surgery on the heart is serious, right? And it's going to require months and months of recovery. And it's also going to require a complete lifestyle change. So imagine the seriousness. Imagine the recovery process, and imagine the drastic lifestyle changes that are necessary if your heart is so blocked that you need triple bypass surgery. Well, in our text, what we are going to see is that all of us need triple bypass surgery in order to save and to change our hearts. See, because for the third time in 3 chapters, right? Chapter 8 last week, Jesus says he must die. We just looked at chapter 9. He says he must die. And now we come to the third one. And what the third one is going to show us is that there is something in us that is blocking the life of Jesus from flowing through us to other people. And this is Jesus' third and final passion narrative before reaching his destination in Jerusalem. And in all 3 statements, Jesus is clearly stating what it means for him to be the Messiah. For him to be the Christ means the cross. He must go to the cross. And every time he says this, it causes an immediate reaction from his disciples. Their reaction shows us just how bad the blockage in our heart really is. See, the 3 times Jesus is talking about his glory and how it's going to be seen in his suffering. It's going to be seen in his death. It's going to be seen in then him rising from the dead 3 days later. All 3 times when he talks about this, the disciples are concerned about their glory. They're concerned about their greatness. They're concerned about their status. They're concerned about their honor. In chapter 8, Peter actually rebukes Jesus for saying that he must suffer and die. He rebukes him because he's more concerned about preserving his own life and being on the winning team than he is giving up his life for the good of others. In chapter 9, all the disciples, they distance themselves from Jesus. And then they argue who's the greatest. And then now, in our text, the sons of thunder, James and John, they want the 2 highest positions in God's kingdom next to the king. Now, you may have thought you were coming here for a routine checkup, but God has found something seriously wrong with you. Your heart is so blocked by your desire to be great that you need triple bypass surgery in order to save it. But when the procedure is over and God has grafted his son's sacrifice into your heart, his life now will flow through your veins to make you the kind of person who seeks to love and serve and make others great. I'm going to have you stand for the reading of God's word. We're going to look at Mark 10, verses 32 through 45. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they must have noticed something about Jesus' countenance here, okay? Because this seems weird. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. So they saw a change in Jesus that amazed them and made them afraid. And talking to the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise." And then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, they came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." And Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left, it's not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." Now, when the 10 heard this, they began to be indignant at James and John. A fight's about ready to break out, okay? And Jesus then called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This is the word of the Lord. All right, you may take your seats, and I'm going to quickly pray. Our gracious Heavenly Father, because this text is going to be doing major heart surgery on all of us, We know that the surgeon's scalpel is sharp and that it cuts deeply and quickly. But we also know that the hands that hold it are the ones who heal. And so I pray you would convict us where we need to be convicted, and then comfort and heal us with the reality of why we need Jesus' service. And then would you help us to trust in his service? And I pray that you would do this for your glory and for our good. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, what is love and how do you measure it? Is love equated to a feeling, or is it simply a mere action? And then, can love even be measured? Which is a good question. I mean, we could do a word study on love, right, in the Greek. We could look at agape, which is the general love for all people. We could look at phileo, which refers to more of a friendship love. And then we could look at eros, which refers to romantic love. But at the end of the day, the question remains, what is love and how do we measure somebody's love for us? You know, we say we love people all the time, right? But how do we know when we really mean it? I mean, family members, do you say that I love you to one another, but don't really mean it? And then what do you do when you do say I love you and you don't really mean it? I mean, kids, how would you answer this question? I know mom and dad love me because, fill in the blank. We're a married couple. I know my spouse loves me because, fill in the blank. Or for you singles, I know I'm in love when, fill in the blank. Or I know that somebody else loves me because, fill in the blank. Love can only be expressed in relationship to others. Love, true love, cannot be expressed in isolation from others. There's got to be someone that love is expressed to. Now, there is something that we call self-love. And what's the word that we use to describe people who are in love with themselves? Narcissist, right? From the Greek mythology of Narcissus, the dude who saw his reflection in a pool of water and fell in love with the image. And he couldn't take his eyes off of himself. And then over time, because he couldn't take his eyes off of himself, he was unable to leave the reflection in the water, and he drowned. What we're seeing in our text this morning is how narcissistic self-love will destroy us and harm others, while true love, the kind of love that sacrifices what you want for the good of the other, will actually bring life. So what is love? And how do we measure it? Well, I believe Jesus defines it in Mark 8, verse 34. He says, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. Here's my definition. Love is costly self-sacrifice. Love is denying yourself. It's dying to yourself. It's living devoted to the glory of God for the good of others. You see, ever since chapter 8, Jesus has been teaching his disciples what true discipleship really is. He's teaching them this is what it means to be a Christian. This is what life in God's kingdom is like. And now we not only see the clearest statement of who Jesus is and what it means for him to be the Messiah, but we also see the pattern of the gospel and the type of people that the gospel produces. The gospel produces people who love God and express love for him by displaying his love to one another. So here's my proposition. True greatness is measured by how well we love and serve others, while love is measured by how great the sacrifice is. The greater the sacrifice, the greater the love. And I just want to quickly point out something to you. If any of you are in any type of ministry, this passage should actually be a great encouragement to you. Because think about it. The fact that the disciples, those closest to Jesus, didn't get it, ought to encourage you when you want others to get the gospel. In other words, it's encouraging because the blockage in our heart is so great that the greatest of the disciples didn't get it. Peter, James, and John. And if the greatest of the disciples didn't get it because God has chosen not to break through yet, then doesn't that encourage you to be more patient with others? That it might take more time for God to break through to them? See, why don't the disciples get it? Okay, here's the answer. Because they're so addicted to their own greatness. They are so stuck on self. They are so preoccupied and absorbed with self that they can't get outside of themselves until God ultimately breaks through. And we're no different. We're all narcissists. We're all self-absorbed. We're all self-centered. We're all preoccupied with self. We are all consumed with self. And because we are, we need triple bypass surgery. And the recovery process, it may take a lot longer than we think, though. See, our passage is the most descriptive of Jesus' three passion narratives, but it's also the one that exposes the blockage in our heart more than the others do. Look at verse 32. All right, I was arguing that while on the way, something must have changed in Jesus' countenance. They saw something in him that frightened them and amazed them. And this is what causes Jesus in verses 33 to 34 then to tell his disciples, see, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and they will deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him, they will spit on him, they will flog him, and they will kill him. And then after 3 days, he will rise. So now we know that Jerusalem is the place where Jesus is going to display his glory as the Messiah. See, in chapter 8, Jesus says that he must suffer, that he must be rejected by the religious leaders, and that he must be killed, and that he must rise again. In chapter 9, he says that he must be handed over, and he will die at the hands of men. But now we know that it's going to happen in Jerusalem. And also we know now that he's going to experience much harsher treatment than what he's described before. Now we find out that the religious leaders are actually going to conspire and hand Jesus over to the Gentiles, where they're going to mock him. They're going to spit on him. They're going to flog him. And then they're going to kill him. And he will rise 3 days later. So this passion narrative, it is more descriptive of Jesus' suffering and dying than the previous two. But what happens next is the most blatant example of human self-centeredness in contrast to Jesus' humility and self-sacrifice. See, look at verse 35. Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Okay, now asking Jesus for things is not bad, right? It's good to make requests of Jesus. It's a good thing for us to pour out our hearts and tell him what our desires are. But do you see what they're asking for? They're asking for Jesus to sign a blank check and hand it over to them. They're basically saying this: whatever we want, will you give it to us with no limits? We want a blank check so we can cash it on ourselves and whatever we want. Now, I want you to notice how Jesus responds, because this is not how I would respond. Jesus knows their hearts, and notice he doesn't respond by saying, "You self-centered, narcissistic, spoiled brats. No, I will not give you what you want." No, he responds by saying in verse 36, "What do you want me to do for you?" And then doesn't verse 37 tell us what their heart's desire really is? "Grant us to sit one at your right and the other at your left in your glory." I mean, holy cow, they go for broke here, don't they? I mean, they're asking for the highest positions of power. They're asking for the highest positions of honor and status next to the king. Right after Jesus talks about his glory being displayed in Jerusalem by being mocked, humiliated, tortured, and killed, we see self-centeredness with no limits here. We see hearts so stuck on self that they can't even think about other people. Their preoccupation with self is blocking them from being concerned or mindful or even aware of other people. Because did you notice who they left out? Right? Isn't the inner circle made up of three? James, John, and Peter? Why did they leave Peter out? Did they purposely leave Peter out because they might have felt threatened by him? Or were they so consumed and preoccupied with themselves that they couldn't get outside of themselves to even consider Peter? See, we don't know. But Peter's not even on their radar. And you got to ask, I wonder how that made Peter feel. Right? You see, Peter's the source of this gospel. Mark is writing this gospel because Peter is giving him the eyewitness account of the events that happened. So I wonder how long it took for Peter to get over this. I wonder how long it took for him to push past the pain of being neglected and not even thought of or recognized. See, the self-centered blockage in our hearts is so great, it does what? It harms and hurts other people. See, but James and John's hearts aren't the only ones being exposed here. Look at verse 41. Holy cow. "And when the 10 heard it," so now we know how Peter feels about this as well as the others. "When the 10 heard it, they became indignant at James and John." See, indignant, that's a nicer translation. Okay? No, they are white hot mad and filled with rage, which means a fight's about to break out. Okay? They're so mad. But why? You ever thought about that? Why are they indignant at what James and John requested of Jesus? I mean, are they so mad because they feel left out and excluded? Maybe. Or maybe because they had the same ambition and James and John simply beat them to it by asking Jesus before they got the chance to ask him what they all wanted. Either way, a fight's about to break out between the disciples. Each of their hearts are so blocked by their own self-interest that nobody cares for and no one is even mindful of the others at all. In other words, nobody shows love here. Instead, what are they doing? They're pushing each other down in order to climb to reach the top and be first. Each is seeking to get ahead and be better than the other. Now, if this is the third time, if this is the third incident in 3 chapters that shows us how stuck on self we really are, that shows us how concerned with our own greatness we really are, then this is a pretty serious condition, isn't it? And it is one that is going to require drastic measures to fix. See, the blockage in our heart is so bad that it will only take triple bypass surgery to heal it. The addiction to self, in other words, it's so powerful and is so serious that it must be dealt with. It's so destructive not only because it will harm and destroy us, but it'll harm and destroy others. It must be fixed if we are ever to change and learn how to love and serve one another. Now I want you to look at Jesus' response in verses 38 through 39. You don't know what you're asking, James and John. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they said to him, we are able. I mean, James and John, they think so highly of themselves that they think they can actually do what Jesus must do as the Messiah. You see, the irony of their request is that in verses 33 through 34, Jesus told them where the moment of his greatest glory will be. It will not be seated on a throne in heaven. It will be hanging on a cross with someone on his right and someone on his left. But because James and John can't get outside of themselves, they can't see that their desire for self-importance is the reason why Jesus must die. See, the cup that Jesus is going to drink is the cup of God's wrath. And the baptism that will be baptized with is how Jesus is going to be immersed, overwhelmed, and flooded by drinking that cup down to the very last drop. James and John, you do not know what you are asking. Because are you willing to give up greatness and power in order to strengthen and make others great? Are you willing to give up the glory of sitting at my Father's right hand so that others could receive his glory and enter into his kingdom? Are you willing to face the horror of being separated from God so that others could be reconciled to God? Are you willing to face God's displeasure so that others could have his favor? Are you willing to experience the shame of having God turn his back and reject you so that others could have God's face and experience the joy of his embrace? Are you willing to be handed over and humiliated to people who think they're greater than you, who will mock you, who will spit on you, who will flog you, who will ultimately conspire with their enemies to kill you? In other words, James and John, are you willing to sacrifice everything to do this? For narcissistic, selfish, self-centered, self-absorbed people. But because I'm willing to do what you will not, you do not know what you're asking. you will drink the cup of serving others for their good. You will be persecuted and suffer for doing good to others. But to sit at my right or my left, that's not up for me to give. That's whoever my Father gives it to. Now, because none of the disciples get Jesus' mission, and because there's a fight that's about to break out, because nobody cares and loves one another and is mindful of one another here, Jesus in verses 42 through 44, he summons them to himself because he wants to teach them what love for others looks like in God's kingdom. You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles, they lord, in other words, they hold their authority and rulership over others, thinking they're better than others. And then you know that how their great one, they exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. So what's he saying? Jesus is calling them together to say there's another way to live. It's the way of loving and serving others. Instead of living for your good, instead of demanding that others serve you and your desires, you serve them. You live for them. Live outside of yourself, in other words, by living for the good of others. Instead of trying to be great, make others great. See, the point of our passage is very clear, isn't it? Serve others, not self. See, the place of greatness in God's kingdom is where you give up your greatness to make others great. You become the least. That's how you become great in God's kingdom. Now, this is interesting too, because the fact that Jesus mentions those who are in positions of leadership is significant, because this means then this is applicable to anybody in any authoritative or leadership position. Elders, deacons, husbands, wives, parents, older siblings, teachers, bosses, all the way up to the president or to a king. When you're a citizen of God's kingdom, your position of leadership, it's not so that others can serve you. It's so you can serve others. See, the reality of God's kingdom is serving others. It's not serving self. In other words, it's to exhaust yourself so that others can be strengthened. It's to let go of your reputation so others may gain one. It is to love others by denying yourself, by dying to yourself, taking up your cross and living for the glory of God by living for the good of others. Look at verse 43. But it shall not be so among you. All right, I'm going to have to fly. Jesus here is not commanding us to live differently than the non-Christians here. He's not saying, don't live like they do. No, the statement, it's not an imperative, it's an indicative, which means Jesus is he's not prescribing how we should live. He's describing what life in God's kingdom looks like. In other words, this is how life in God's kingdom is. Jesus is describing the way of life that he creates in us. See, look at verse 45, because Jesus has given us the basis for what he had just said in verses 42 through 45. For, connected to what I just said, even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life away as a ransom for many. This is the most mind-blowing statement in all the Bible. This is the theme of Mark's gospel. This one verse. Think of it. The King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the greatest being in all of the universe, did not come for us to serve him, but he came to stoop beneath and below us, those that he made, in order to serve them. And what am I saying? Serving others, not yourself, is descriptive of the kingdom of God, because that's who Jesus is. That's what Jesus does. So he's showing us the pattern, in other words, of the gospel. Jesus' sacrificial service creates the type of people who sacrificially love and serve others. You see, verse 45, it tells us not just that Jesus will die, but why he must die. Don't miss that. Because if Jesus does not serve us, then we will drink the cup of God's wrath. Because of how offensive our sin is to him, but also because of how harmful our selfishness is to others. So here we go. If greatness is measured by how well we love and serve others, and love is measured by how great the sacrifice, then how great is God's love for us? That Jesus sacrificed everything. Everything. So he could give you everything. You see, the only way that you and I will ever be able to get outside of ourselves is to have Jesus perform triple bypass surgery on our heart. The seriousness of our condition requires the service of Jesus to ransom us. Well, what does ransom mean? It means to make a payment in order to release someone from some kind of bondage, like a prisoner of war or a slave, or a payment for a debt that is owed. Jesus pays the debt that we owe God with his blood, but he does it in our place so we don't have to pay. And once we're ransomed, we're free. In other words, we are so imprisoned to ourselves that Jesus had to die in order to free us. To free us from sin's payment and penalty, but also to free us from ourselves. To free us to think about other people. To free us to love. Because we are so stuck on self, in other words, we need someone to be great for us. Someone who will live in such a way that they always sacrifice their own interests for the interest of others. Which means only Jesus is great. Because he became the least. But he became the least in order to make the least great. So here it is. When Jesus' ransom is grafted into your heart, his sacrificial service is now what flows through your veins. And when it flows through your veins, it then causes you to live a life of service for others. So here we go. The exhortation is not going to be what you think it is. The exhortation of our text, it's not, stop being so selfish, get outside of yourself and serve others. That's not the exhortation. And the reason why is because we can't get outside of ourselves unless God breaks through. Which means the exhortation of this text, it's let Jesus serve you. Let Jesus serve you. You and I cannot get outside of ourselves until God breaks through to show us just how self-centered and selfish and self-absorbed we really are. It is only when we see that will we look to Jesus for healing. See, here's the point. When you see Jesus' costly self-sacrifice for you, it doesn't just free you, it forgives you. And doesn't seeing that then free you to honestly admit how selfish you are to God and to others? Doesn't it free you to face your sin in all of its ugliness? Because when you face that, doesn't Jesus' costly self-sacrifice then become more beautiful to you? Jesus' costly sacrificial service has paid your ransom in order to forgive and free you, not just from sin's penalty, but also from yourself. You see, when your heart is healed by Jesus' sacrifice,